Today on the bench we have a Cornwell CAT4280 half-inch air impact, and the customer stated that one of the direction selector switches flew out. So he gave me a bag of parts and asked me to take a look at it. I can't wait to dig in. 3 out of the 4 body screws were already removed. We're going to need a 3mm hex key to take care of the final one. This one's already been loosened. And these body screws travel all the way through the body into the hammer assembly housing to keep everything together. Keep the tool on a horizontal surface when you remove the 2 halves of the tool, because parts can fall out if you have it on end. Usually, this is the rotor assembly here. It'll stay in the housing. Sometimes it pulls out when you pull everything apart, but I'm not as familiar with how these are constructed as I am with the Ingersolls, I believe, because this one has a CAT as part of its part number that is made by AirCat, but I'm not 100% sure. So we're just going to take this slow and easy and see what we discover on the way, because I'm not exactly sure how it goes together, although it looks extremely familiar to me. It looks like how the Ingersolls are constructed, but there's always something new and different in these models, so we're just going to take it easy. Normally, when I see the rotor assembly and the hammer housing like this, they should just pull apart, but this is not doing that. So I don't know if something's jammed in there. It kind of looks like the hammer assembly is a little cockeyed on there. So it might just be that it was disassembled and reassembled incorrectly, but this is all part of the discovery here. Looks like it's a little higher on this side than that side. Can you see that? So it looks like there was some finagling going on here and stuff didn't go back together quite right. There is some movement if I rock it back and forth. And if it doesn't ease its way out, we can try tapping on the end of the anvil to drive the whole housing out. And it looks like we've gotten to that point, so let's give a little tap and see what happens. Easy enough. That was just jammed in there. So remember, get all your parts everywhere. Step 1. All right, when we take this apart, we're going to look at all the individual pieces and inspect them as we go, just to see if we can find any damage to anything. I always like to give these things a complete look over and overhaul, including a thorough cleaning and relubrication. So first thing I'm going to do is inspect the inside of the hammer housing. There's always going to be a grease buildup in there, and such is the case here. And I look for metal filings and any fragments of any part of the mechanism that may have broken off or worn over time. Sometimes the inside surface of this gets chewed up too, but it looks really good. Next is the hammer and anvil assembly. This is the anvil, this is the hammer cage, and here's the 2 hammers. They're held in with these 2 pins here. Just jiggle the anvil to work the dogs out, and the whole thing just pops out. And it also looks like it's in pretty good shape. Next, you gotta remove these 2 pins. They had to slide right out, and then the hammers will lift right out of the cage. So with a pocket screwdriver, just push out the pins, and then you lift the cage off the hammers, and there they are. And they also look to be in very good shape. The hammer cage sometimes shows signs of wear on the outside surface. Sometimes the spline drive in here that meshes with the spline on the front of the rotor can be worn, but that also looks pretty good. The speed switch needs to come off too. That should just pull off. Yep. And it just sets into the back of the rotor housing, and we can see the back of the housing. There's an indicator pin that'll get us lined up properly with a slot in the switch. When we put it back together again, and there's the rear of the rotor in the center, and it is also nested into a shielded bearing. Now to get the plate off. On the Ingersolls, that just sets right on and presses on there. They're not generally too difficult to get off. They usually pop right off, but sometimes you have to use a little bit of persuasion to get it off there. Such might be the case with this. unless there's screws or something in there that I can't see. So it always pays to double check. But it looks like, oh, it looks like there are screws in there. Looks like there's a screw here and a screw here that holds the plate on. I can't tell what the head type. Maybe it's a 3mm hex. It's not. Looks like it's a 2mm hex screw. There you go, and the plate comes right off and exposes the rotor, and we see this is a 6-blade rotor. And on some versions of this, there's a snap ring in the back that keeps the rotor in there. That is not the case with this, so it might just pop out. The vanes just fall out, so we're going to take those out first. And you can inspect these for wear too. This long edge here sometimes gets worn down. I've seen people sand the edge on this just to give it a new surface. I don't know if that degrades the performance at all. If they're worn out, they're not difficult or expensive to replace, but these actually look like they're in pretty good shape. That took a little more work than I was thinking it would. I just had to take this over to the bench vise and mount this in here, and then I tapped on the back of this with a punch, but it still wasn't budging, so I applied a little bit of heat to it, and after I applied the heat, it popped out. Took a little bit more persuading than you typically find on these, and that means that we're left with the shielded bearing that's still in there. I do want to take it out, and these are never easy because when they're tight like this, they're very difficult, but you can see in there is a bit of a gap where the bearing sets on the shoulder of the rotor housing. If I can get a pick or some other small tool in there, then I can start to work this out. I might have to apply a little more heat to it to do that too. So let's see how complicated that becomes. Sometimes you can get in there with a 90-degree pick and get that point in that gap and work it out that way. This one's giving me some trouble, so I'm going to put it aside for now and work on getting the bearing out of the plate. I brought this over to the bench vise and put it in there where there is a larger gap between the shoulder of the plate and the bearing, so I was able to get a small punch in there and just start tapping in this way and go around a number of times, and I finally got it worked out a little bit, so we're just going to pop it out the rest of the way. It is now sometime later after that last scene I shot because I wanted to take enough time to explore removing this bearing. I had asked some YouTube friends of mine and some viewers who are rather skilled in the ways of machining and mechanics to see if they had any ideas, and I did get a lot of good suggestions, including using cold to try to shrink the bearing, and some guys who have machining backgrounds suggested how a machinist would do it. I am not equipped to do such things, and nothing that I tried worked. The bearing is still wedged in there, and I started to wonder, could it be adhered in there? Could someone have used epoxy? When I look at the edge of the bearing here, it's rather dark where the outer race meets the wall of the housing, and I wonder if that's some kind of epoxy. which should not be there unless there's something weird to the build on these Cornwell units. I tried heat on this, but it didn't. If there's an epoxy there, it didn't melt it. I cannot get this out using conventional methods. Now, could I remove this if I welded, say, a bolt in there and punched it out, or if I welded a cross piece in there and punched out from the inside? Absolutely, I'm sure that something eventually would provide enough force to drive that bearing out. But I'm concerned about damaging this housing because this unit here is expensive. It costs about $130, and I don't want to damage it. So given that this bearing is working, I opted to leave it in. And I took some extra time on this, both to explore how to do it and to explain that to my customer. He's fine with it. I did tell him at some point down the line, if that bearing goes bad, it may be that removing it is complicated enough and that we're going to cause some damage to the housing, in which case we'll have to replace the housing. He was okay with that. He said that this is his backup unit anyway, so he's not too concerned about that kind of thing right now. As long as it's working for him, he's fine with it. So we're going to proceed with that bearing in the housing, and we'll try to relubricate as best we can. They're shielded bearings, so it might be difficult to get some lubrication back in there. So again, my concerns are that because I heated it, and if I'm going to put this through the solvent tank to wash the housing out, I'll be gentle on the bearing, but I already applied heat to it, which could have liquefied the lubricant in there and caused it to run out. I will try to re-lubricate as best I can by applying more lube in there and maybe heating up some grease and seeing if it seeps back into the bearing, but I don't know. In either case, we know the bearing currently works. It feels all right, feels smooth enough, but when this thing's being used under load and at speed, I don't know how it's going to behave differently. So it's kind of a crapshoot. But again, everything's been conveyed to my customer, who said he's okay with what we're deciding to do here. So the final thing to remove is the valve here that directs the flow of air up one side of the rotor or the other to determine the direction, and that's controlled by the buttons in the back that you push to turn that valve, which then sends air up one side or the other. So we know that this one button is the one that flew out, and this button was the one that was still in the tool. And I puzzled for a while about how to remove this because it was not coming out for love nor money. I looked on the schematic. It isn't in good enough resolution to see any details of these, either from the manufacturer or from our part supplier. So I really don't know what to think. And as I'm looking over the construction of the one that came out, I couldn't see any damage on it. I couldn't tell if parts were missing that were supposed to be there. So I didn't know a good way to remove the one that was in there. So I did a little finger crossing and a little hoping, and I applied some upward pressure to this to try to force it out. And I don't like doing that because that's usually when things break. But when you don't know what else to do, sometimes you got to give a little bit of muscle to it, and I did, and it popped out. And what I found here was that there is this little barbed catch on there that is missing on the piece that flew out. Well, that answers the question as to why this did not get retained in there, because the little catch is gone. See, it's supposed to be hanging off right there, and it's not. See if you can see these two side by side, or one on top, one on the bottom. See, that piece is gone down here. It's supposed to be there. It's not. This part is the part that holds everything in. So I think that solves the mystery of why that flew out. Why it broke, though, is another question that I don't know if we can answer. We're going to push the valve out. That just pushes either down. I think it also pushes up, but I usually just push it down and spit it out through the hole in the handle here. There it is. And we'll see if there's any pieces that fall out with it. Nope. We'll inspect the valve for damage and see if anything looks out of the ordinary there. It does not. It has these teeth on it here that mesh with the teeth on the buttons, and that pushes the valve so that it spins and directs the airflow. That looks like it's in good shape. Something that this Impact has that the Ingersolls don't have are these support bars. I don't know what their function is. I can't tell. But they slide into these squared slots here, and I think they rest like up against a portion of these buttons. And I don't know what these support, because they are either to the side or on top of the buttons. It's not like they're underneath it, keeping it lifted up or supporting it. The valve doesn't touch them. I don't know what they do. But one of them is missing. There's supposed to be one on this side, one on the other side, and one of them is gone. And this button is broken. So I think all we have to do is order a new button and order a support bar. Everything else looks like it's in good working shape. The parts arrived. I have the left and right support bars and the forward and reverse buttons. Let's reassemble. We're going to start with the rotor housing, and I typically like to put the valve assembly in first. So we're going to have, this is the air inlet with a valve assembly here, and the directional valve that goes in the body. There's O-rings on here, so we're going to lube that up. And for that we use Ingersoll air tool grease. On the Ingersoll units, this can be pushed up from the bottom. I believe that's the case here too, but I'll see if I can push it from the top because it's a little bit easier. But no, it looks like I got it coming from the bottom. Okay, the way these go in is there's a tab right there that has to face toward the rear of the rotor housing. If you have it reversed, it won't work right. It will not fit in there. Rather, the forward and reverse ones won't fit because they have to mesh with these gears here on the side. So tab here goes toward the back of the unit. If it's reversed, the buttons won't fit right. So we'll just insert this up through the handle. And use a long tool like a screwdriver or a pick just to press that up in there. Until that sits right at the top like it should. Next, I'll install the support bars. I have no idea what purpose these serve. I tried to get information on it, but I couldn't find anything. And there are a couple of different ways these can be inserted in there. From what I gather by looking at schematics, and it's not easy, no schematic is high resolution. So to get any level of detail is very difficult. I think the way these go in is, if you look at the different ends, this has, it's kind of like a tab on it there. So the piece angles down a little bit. It does not have it on the other end. I believe these face the front. Now, if I'm wrong, I have no idea what adverse effect that may have. It may not have any adverse effect. I don't know. So if these face the front, then there's only one way they can go in, and the holes on here are shaped such that you have to have the shape of the support bar conform to the shape of the hole. So this one's going to go in here like so. And and it's funny because as you push this in, you feel increasing resistance, almost like the hole that this is going in is tapered. It's weird. Usually when parts fit together, you're expecting there to be some positive connection that tells you when it's been inserted correctly. Such is not the case here. I can keep pushing this back until it's flush, So let's do that, because the thing that mates up to this is the hammer housing, and that's got to be a flush fit. So that's going to fit flush here. So I'm just going to give that a push as far back as I can get it, and that's it. And then we take the other one and do the same thing on the other side. Push it in, and then just feel it give me resistance until I have that flush back there. That's a weird design. Now we'll put in the directional buttons. You know what I just found in here? I just found the broken tab for the old directional button. This is the part that broke off of this piece here in the old one. That was sitting down inside the handle, and when I pushed that valve up, I dislodged this piece. It was sitting right in the housing, right behind the valve. I just noticed it now. So this thing broke off and survived additional use, survived me disassembling this whole thing, cleaning it, and only now that I find it upon reassembly. That's weird. Keeps you guessing. Now, my only frame of reference to this is really the Ingersoll units, and this looks similar enough that I'm guessing it works the same, in that this valve here is going to swivel 45 degrees on either side of center when you push the directional buttons. The way I normally have the Ingersoll ones set up when I reassemble is to have the valve already lined up to one side so that when I put the directional buttons in, they mesh with the gears appropriately. So I'm going to try to do that with this, and it's going to take a little finagling to get it right, make sure it's sitting in there, because it doesn't fit quite as smooth as the Ingersoll ones do, so we might have to do a little playing around here. Well, let's see what we can do. It's very difficult, based on how tight this fits, to really position it exactly the way I think it needs to be. So I'm just going to insert one of the buttons and see if that will move that gear into the right position. And the thing that causes me some trepidation here is, once I insert this, it's not easy to take it out. That plastic there is very rigid, and that tab doesn't really give. So I don't know how to pop this back out effectively without risking breaking the tab again. On other designs, the tab is on the inside, and you insert a pocket screwdriver and just push it, and then it moves the tab out of the way and pop these things right out. But you can't do that with this. Number one, the top of the button's in the way here, so you don't get a clear shot to the tab, and there's really no movement here. So it makes me a little nervous to have to do this one time and then and see what happens, but you know, that's what we got to do. So a little bit of grease goes on here, and we'll push that in and see what happens. You got to clear the tab there when you get it in. Well, I was exactly afraid of this happening, and it happened. In order for me to try to get the directional switch in there, I pushed it in, and that was a little force to do it. The problem is the tab engaged, and now I don't know how to get this back out, and this has to be back out for me to put the valve in. So I was doing some experimentation here to see if I needed to remove the valve. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm just trying different things here, and I'm stuck because I have to get this back out, but I don't want to break it, and I risk breaking it if I just use force to pull this out, because there's no way to actually move that tab out of the way. So I'm in a bind here. Luckily, though, I have the original button that is not broken, so if I break this, I could always use the original, but I don't like doing that. So we'll see And you can't just pry this out because the edge here is tapered, so you can't get anything under there to really lift. I can't insert the screwdriver along the outside here to try to bend that tab. There simply is no room for it to get in, and because of the angle the screwdriver would have to go into, I can't insert it like straight down. So it would have to go in at an angle like that, which you can't do. Not a fan of this design. Ingersolls are a bit easier. They have the tab on the inside here, and they don't have this lip, so you can insert something straight down, press that tab out of the way, and pop the buttons out. But this is a little more secure than that and a little tougher to work on as a result. All right, well, if I squeeze it really hard with a pair of pliers, I pop that out. Okay, so at least I'm that much farther along. Let's put the valve back in. Now we'll try reinserting this. Little tappy tap. Well, that's in. Let's see if we can do the same thing to the other side. Well, good news and bad news. The good news is they both went in. The bad news is that valve is out of position. That tab needs to go to 45 degrees each side of center, and you can tell how it is not going to 40. It's going to less than 45 there and going more than 45 there. So the only way I know to remedy this is to pull it back apart, try to line that valve up again, and see if we can get this to work. I may have just got it, so let's put the other button in and see if it works right. That looks correct. You see how now the valve is going 45 degrees of center. That's exactly what we want. All right. So all our repaired parts are now in. Got the support bars there. Got the two directional buttons in, and it's time to put the rest of it back together, which should go totally smooth. This is the muffler it goes in first. It's just a piece of foam that fits into the handle. That's it. And then this guy goes on top. And there is a torque screw that holds that in there. And that's a T10 torque screw. Now this assembly should line up and fit correctly. And it does. I can tell because when I look through the hole, I can see light on the other end, which means that groove is where it needs to be. And how you put the pin in matters. There's a flush cut slot here, and there's a hole there. We're going to feed the grooved slide of the pin through the hole because the hole is a relief cut to handle the head of the pin, and then you just slide the E-clip on this end here. And I say all that like it's really easy, but these clips are such a pain in the neck, especially these small ones. So we're just going to put that on there and try to slide that clip in place. Alright, that's in there. So this assembly now is complete. The trigger just inserts in on the Ingersolls. There's a hook on the end of the trigger that engages the valve stem on the air valve. Not so here. This is just a little notch, and this is not retained the same way as the Ingersolls. This is retained by some tabs on top of the trigger, and when the plate goes on here, it engages these tabs. So this is another difference in the design here. But you can see how it just slides right in, and then it engages the valve stem. I think that's it for now on this. We're going to work on the rotor assembly. The spline drive on the rotor goes toward the front. The spindle goes toward the back and sets in through that hole in that bearing that I couldn't get out. That's kind of a tight fit, so let's see if we can get that in place. I swear to God, if the bearing pops out from me doing this, I'm going to hit the wall. Alright, the rotor's flush in the back and flush at the top. Now we insert the rotor blades. These are pretty easy to put in. Just put them in so that the contoured side goes in toward the center of the rotor. First, I like to put a drop of lube in each slot. This is just air tool oil from Ingersoll. One drop in each slot should do it. You're going to lube this up later on anyway, and if the owner is using it correctly, he's going to put oil in it after he uses it. So don't go nuts over oiling it. You have the potential of creating too much surface area with excessive oil, so that the blades don't come out of their slots the way they need to for this to work right. So all those are in there, this is spinning properly. That's what we like. Perfect. All right, next we got to put the bearing back in the plate here. It should just press right in without too much fuss. But like everything else on this one, it's usually more fuss involved than I'm used to on this. So ideally I just want to press that in, but it's not wanting to go without needing a little bit of force behind it. The best way to drive a bearing in, if you don't have a press, is to use something like a socket which can fit over the race. You don't want to put it on the protective cover here, because you're going to bend it and then you're going to wreck your bearing. So get a socket that fits over that race and very gently tap it in. And you can tell I'm going around it because sometimes it doesn't set in evenly and you got to kind of tap one side or the other to even it out. So my point about using the socket is whatever you do, don't use a punch on this because you're gonna wreck it. So very carefully, methodically, progressively use a socket or something that fits over there, gives you enough surface area that you're not going to damage it. The only thing left to do with the rotor assembly is to mate the plate up with the housing. There's a couple of holes in the bottom there that match up with cutouts in the bottom of the plate here. So just line those up and make sure that your screw holes are aligned, because there's screw holes in here that line up with the screw holes here. Once those are aligned, as luck would have it, we got to tap this into place now too, because of reasons. Holes are lined up, that's now setting solidly, and we're going to put the screws back in using some blue Loctite. And the T10 screwdriver is all you need here. Now we can insert the rotor assembly into the housing. There's a channel there that matches up with a channel in the housing. So just line those up. And you know this is right when the speed switch is sitting flush with the back of the housing. Perfect. Next, the gasket goes over the face of this, and there is an upside down and right side up to this. If you look at the edge, you can see how this is stepped. On the edge, that step part goes against the housing face because it has to set over this lip here. Just like that. Next we do the hammer assembly and put it all in the hammer housing. We have the hammer housing here, the hammer cage, the anvil, the two hammers, and two pins. First thing to do is line up the hammers with the hammer cage. If you look at the hammers, they look like there's a cutout of a ghost with his arms up in the air. One hammer goes with the ghost arms up, the other goes with the ghost arms down, and you just lay them over each other and lay them horizontally in the cage. The grooves on the side go toward the side of the cage. I'm going to stop here because I want to read you something that was sent to me by a viewer, Mr. Bobby 3340, and I genuinely appreciate the time and the effort that he took to write this. This to me is what the real benefit of having a YouTube channel is, when people have genuine information and they want to share it because it's how we all learn. I'm by no means a guy who knows everything about this stuff, and a lot of the times when it comes to working on ear tools, especially something like this Cornwell one, I'm learning as I go because it's different enough that I don't know exactly what it is I'm looking at, so I got to figure things out. And some of the reasons why there's so many edits in these videos is because I'll try something, it doesn't work, I'll try something else, it doesn't work. If I left that all in there, you'd be watching a 14-hour video. So just to whittle that down, I cut that stuff out. So Mr. Bobby 3340 writes, I appreciate your video. Oh, this was in reference to a different air tool repair video. I appreciate your video. I have this model and rebuilt mine based on your video. There's one critical error in your video that can drive folks crazy if they follow it closely. You have my attention, Mr. Bobby. When you assemble the hammers into the cage, you must ensure that the inner lips face inside, or you will not have any power when operating the unit. Your orientation in the video has one hammer with the inner lips facing inside and the second is facing outside. When I first reassembled, all seemed to work fine until I actually had to remove a bolt. Had no power. This was the problem. Again, thank you for the video. It allowed me to repair this impact that was giving me problems. And I said, in reply, thank you for your insight on this. Admittedly, I'm not familiar with the inner lips you're referring to. The hammers have flat surfaces, and my understanding is, as long as they're aligned such that the slots on the side properly accept the pins, which is the orientation I just showed you, they're correct. Can you elaborate on the lips you're referring to? And he says, if you look closely at one hammer, one side is different from the other. One side is flat, while the other side has grooves on the inner portion of the hammer. The inner grooves face the inside of the cage. And I replied, thank you, I'll give a look at the next one I get. Well, this is the next one I got. And I cannot find what Mr. Bobby is referring to. When he says, look at one side, if you look closely at one hammer, one side is different from the other. And there's a number of things that we can be referring to as the side of the hammer. We can be referring to this as opposed to this. And yes, those are different because these have grooves that have to match up to accept the pins in the cage. And when you line these up, oriented the way I showed you, they line properly with one narrow groove and one wide groove on each side. Maybe that's not it though. He said that he said one side's flat while the other side has grooves on the inner portion of the hammer. The inner portion of the hammer, not quite sure what that's referring to. Is it inside the hammer? Is it, I don't know, something along these are bezeled edges here, or rather chamfered edges here, if I'm being accurate. But there's no lip on these, and these are identical to the Ingersoll hammers. So I don't know, Mr. Bobby, if you're watching, what exactly you're referring to. So let me do this. Let me just hold this up here so you can see it. And if you could be a little more specific about what it is you see, maybe relative to what I'm holding here, then you can provide some clarity, because I'm not exactly sure, again, what you're referring to. And I want to make sure I do this right. Now, having said all that, I'll say this. Of all the ones I have reassembled, I have never had one not work properly. I've never had one with low power, because I've had the alignment of the hammers with the one goes facing down, the other facing up. As long as you have them aligned like this, that's, as far as I know, correct. And when I look at schematics on this, there is no differentiation between which side of the hammer is facing what. So I hopefully will get some clarification from Mr. Bobby 3340, or if you know, please chime in. This is important stuff. So I'm going to reassemble this the way I've always done it and the way I know how to do it and the way I know that works. If this is incorrect, I need to know. All right, so the hammer cage sets in your hand like that, and then now that your hammers are aligned properly with one of the narrow grooves against one of the wide grooves, which is the ghost hands facing opposite directions, just drop that in the hammer cage and then insert the pins in the holes here. The first one usually goes in pretty smooth, but the second one you usually have to jiggle the hammers to get the pins to get through the grooves correctly. There you go. Now your hammers are in the cage probably with the pins. Don't turn this on end or the pins will fall out and then everything comes apart. So just lay it down like that. We take the anvil and we want to lube up the dogs on the anvil. These are the dogs, this guy here and this guy here. This is what does all the work with the hammers hitting against the dogs like that. Just put a good amount of grease on there and then insert the anvil through the large hole in the front. You're going to have to twist the anvil a bit to get the lock in there, and when it's in there, it sets flush and you can see the hammers doing their thing. Put some grease all on the outside surfaces here. And I just smooth this out a little bit because it's going to rub off on the side of the housing if you're not careful. So just throw some grease around on there. And this inserts with the anvil first into the housing. There's no right side up or upside down. It just drops in like that. Anvil sticks out the front. And the hammer assembly is done. Last piece is to line everybody up and mate the rotor assembly with the hammer assembly. I suggest keeping everything on a horizontal surface to prevent stuff from falling around. Alright, the body screws will go back in next with a dot of blue Loctite. What the actual? My goodness. Remember, when you're mating two surfaces with a gasket, go in a pattern and go sequentially and progressively increase the torque you're using so that you don't mash your gasket. Alright, with this all back together, let's go out to the compressor and give it a test. Speed selector works, directional buttons work, so we know our repair took. Everything looks like it's good to go, and Larry B, this test was for you. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and keep watching the channel because we've got all kinds of interesting things coming down the line, including more air tool repair videos just like this. Check out the new flyer drop video for the third quarter of 2023 if you have not seen that already. And of course, we always have Tools in the Hall videos. So do me a favor and click down here now to subscribe so that you don't miss any of it. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, use a tool. Don't be one.